This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Well, it's good to be with all of you again this week. And some of you probably heard just recently, I did a podcast interview with a friend of mine, Robert Wolgemuth, who had a great new book that came out on the gun lap. But I want to come back with him because he is such a wealth of information as a literary agent. He's my literary agent. He's my father's agent and has served us well for a number of years. And I just have so many people that will approach me and say, Richard, I've had this book idea for years, or I've written this book, but how do I get a publisher to even look at it? Or is that even realistic? Should I even bother wasting my time? And I get, seriously, I don't know if I go maybe a week without someone reaching out to me to say, hey, any ideas or help on this? I'm a pastor. I've put this into a book, but don't know what to do next. And so I thought Robert would be a great person just to give some high-level counsel. Now, I just want to brag on Robert for a second, just to say, Robert is a high-end literary agent. If we were to list his clients, it's just sort of a who's who of Christian publishing. So Robert has been with some of the very top-name Christian authors, in particular, for decades now, and so he knows the field. And so, Robert, I want to first of all just welcome you back and say thank you for giving us some time to let us pick your brains on writing and publishing.
Well, picking my brain ought to be a real delightful experience. I can't wait to see what that looks like.
Well, Robert, give us just a quick kind of survey of for your literary experience, your experience in publishing. Just some folks would have heard some of that when you were on the podcast before, but in terms of publishing and your experience in that business, give us kind of a synopsis of what you've done.
Sure. I really wasn't aware of what the publishing business was years ago. I thought the printing business was the publishing business, but that's a very different thing. I mean, printing is the mechanics of turning a document into a bound book, printing presses. The publishing business is really what leads up to that. And I have been in the publishing business for 40 years, and I've loved it. It is one of the most competitive businesses you can imagine. So just picture the fact, in fact, again, 40 years doing this business, or in this business, probably 40 years ago, in all kinds of genres, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, New York published, Christian published, whatever, there may have been 5,000 books published 40 years ago. Last year, 1 million books were published.
In 1 year?
I said 1 million books in 1 year.
Wow.
I'm not talking about copies. I'm talking about different titles.
Wow. So
you talk about trying to find shelf space. The biggest bookstore in the world may take 4,000 new titles a year. Maybe. That's a huge bookstore. So if you got 1 million to choose from, that makes it a very competitive thing. Now we got Amazon. People love Amazon and people hate Amazon. If you're in the retail business, you hate Amazon. The word makes your skin crawl because it used to be you walk into a bookstore and you said, do you have a copy of, and you name a book. The guy goes to his microfiche and then eventually to his computer, says, yeah, we had a couple copies, but we reordered it. Come back in a week and maybe I'll have it. Versus you order a book on Amazon, tomorrow it's at your front door. I dare you to compete with that.
Yeah.
So Amazon sells about 65% of the books that are sold in the world. They are the big dog, and you can see where your book falls. They have about 5 million titles that you can buy on Amazon, and you can look at any time you want on your ranking in that 5 million titles. So if you're in the top 10,000, that's incredible. Think about it. If you're in the top 1,000, that's tall cotton, like people used to say in the South. So my point is it's a very competitive business. And it's a very challenging thing to write.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of people, like you say, I've always wanted to be a writer. Yeah, I would. And then you sit down and you start pounding out a manuscript, and it's 60,000 or 80,000 words, and you're thinking to yourself, this is a lot of work. So a lot more people want to publish, want to write, than actually do it. So you add those two things together, very competitive business, and it's hard work to do it. So a lot of people are discouraged once they start down this road. But I wouldn't want to discourage people who really have something to say, or we can talk about that.
Yeah, and Robert, I might add too, in large part because of Amazon, the traditional publishers, their margins have shrunk dramatically. It used to be a publisher would give you an advance, and they would have a certain amount of marketing budget for your book and so on. And now publishers are having such a hard time just breaking even or making a bit of profit on a book.
That's right.
That they're driven, quite honestly, and you know this. There are some people who've written some outstanding books, but they're not famous, and nobody's going to buy their book. And so they'll crank out the 45th book by a well-known person that they know that it may be a tenth as good as this book by this unknown person. But it so much of it now is driven by the numbers. Will people buy this book? And if they don't pick up your book, it doesn't matter how brilliantly it's written. Somehow it's got to get out there. And so publishers they struggle as well, because it's going to be a financial decision. You can tell them in tears about how God gave you this message, and everyone who's ever read this book just loves it. But the publisher is saying, and how many friends do you have, and how many copies will your mother buy? And we've got a formula we've got to work out here. And so in one sense, and we might as well get all the bad news out right off the bat here, Robert. So it's difficult these days. But on the other hand, let's say that there's a person that does have this message that is burning within their soul, and every time they share this at their church group or at work, but I tell you, people are truly blessed by it. And many people have said, you need to get this in a book. And so here's a person, and I would also say, I've been around pastors, I've been around CEOs that have spent decades in successful leadership roles. They've learned all kinds of things. They're very wise. They have a lot of great experiences. And their experiences, their wisdom truly would be a blessing to many people if they could find it between the pages in the pages of a book. And so if one of our listeners, and Rob, you and I both have helped a number of people who did have a great message, but needed help putting it into a book. And we've seen those published, and we've seen them help people. And so what would your advice be? You talk to someone and you have a sense, hey, there is a really good message here, and I've never seen anything quite like that out in all those million books that are published a year or written a year. What would your counsel be to someone that does seem to have a message that it would be helpful if it ever found its way to being published?
Well, I wish you and I had like 3 hours, and I wish everybody we were talking to was in the room where we could see their faces. The first thing that I would say is probably not what you want to hear, but whatever you can do to build a platform, do it. Mm-hmm. Now, you might be the pastor of a big church. Let's say your church has 1,000 people in it, or let's say you run a company and you got 3,000 employees. 1,000, 3,000, those are small numbers in this business. Mm-hmm. There was a woman, the wife of a farmer in northern Canada, who built a social media network through a podcast. This is 15 years ago. And her podcast included, it was really written, so it was really only writing. It wasn't audio or video. And so she built an audience, people listening, primarily women, reading her weekly or so posts. And so she decided to write a book, and it went to #1 New York Times, #1 Amazon, and nobody had ever met her. I'm not kidding. She didn't travel. She didn't speak publicly. What she had was a massive social media platform. So the first question a publisher is going to ask, and it shouldn't be the first question, but it is, describe your platform. And if you have an idea, if you're listening to us and you have an idea for a book, again, I wish this wasn't true. I really do. But talk to some 11-year-old who understands Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all of these platforms, and begin to build an audience of people who follow you. Write 400 or 500 word blogs and find a venue to post them. And people who have established blogs love having guest bloggers. You can ride on somebody else's truck to do that, to begin to build your platform. So the reason why I hate the fact that I'm saying this first is, and you know this is true, you've just indicated, there are people with the message whose message should be heard, and it never will because they don't have a platform.
Yeah.
And I always say, okay, so what was Spurgeon's platform? Describe that the way he had a church. So what was Lewis's platform? Well, he was a thinker and had friends in high places, but he didn't have Facebook, he didn't have Twitter, he didn't have social media. So the reason why their stuff sold and still sells is because they had something to say. Today, you have to have a platform. It's absolutely a must. And I'm in the business of getting proposals in front of publishers. And I think my company does a great job of creating creative, winsome, thorough, informational proposals. But the first thing the publisher looks at is the platform.
Yeah.
How many people follow this guy or this woman?
Yeah.
So that's tragic, but that's the truth. So build a platform and then have something to say. And don't go to the library to come up with something to say. The ethos of your own experience, your own walk with Christ, what he's teaching you. In fact, in the beginning of Gunlap, the book Gunlap, I talk about a conversation I had with Tim LaHaye, who was a good friend, and I published him and loved his heart for the Lord and for culture. And he said to me something I've repeated, I think 500 times, maybe more, that a book is a long letter to one person. So if you're intimidated by writing, think of this being a 50,000 word letter to somebody that you know. So when you're reading along and the writer says, some of you, or many of you, he had a bad editor. Because many of you don't read the book. You read it one at a time. So speak in second person, you. Speak in first person, me. My own story. Let me tell you the story about a man who walked up to me one time in the parking lot of the church and said the following. It's like when you preach, Richard. So you're waxing eloquent. You're expositing the word like a champ, and people are taking notes and whatever. They're looking down, and you say, last week my son and I were in the car and we were talking, and every face looks at you. They want stories. They want illustrations. So your book has to be filled with stories like, what does this look like in real life? It's a long letter to one person, and it's filled with stories. So now you have to be able to write. And there are a lot of people who know how to write and some people who don't. My favorite illustration about writing is writing's really painting. It's not writing. Show me, don't tell me. Show me, don't tell me. Show me, don't tell me. So I've worked, in fact, I was on the phone today with one of the world's renowned collaborators. His skill is writing in other people's voices. So I was on the phone with this collaborator, we call them writers, and an author that I've worked with for 40 years. And we're going to put them together to write a book. And so this author who's written some books said, so what's the benefit of a writer to come alongside? And I say, here's the deal. You're telling a story, and the people who are reading it want to picture it. So tell me what kind of shirt you were wearing. Tell me the color, whatever. I'm preaching on the street corner, and I've got this bright yellow shirt on. I can see that, and I want to know that. So now I'm preaching. Can you hear my voice? I'm excited about this because so many people miss this stuff. And they don't realize, here's the magic of a book. And you know this is true because you're an author. When somebody comes up to you and says, I started reading your book, and how do they finish the sentence? I couldn't put it down. You might be in a public place, but you're going to kiss that person right on the face for having said that, because that's what you're looking for. You're looking for the kind of writing that challenges people to lay it down. The truth is, my library is full of books with a boarding pass about 50 pages in, and I'm never going back to it because it's a waste of my time. You don't feel bad about laying a book down. You feel bad because you spent money on it. But you don't feel bad. So let's say I'm in the audience and you're preaching. You're standing at the pulpit and you're preaching, and you're actually boring. I'm not enjoying this. I've already planned my day out. But you'd have to be really bad for me to get up and walk out. The challenge of writing is speaking on drugs. If you're not daring the people to lay the book down and not finish reading it, then you need to keep working on it until you hone your craft, until your writing is picturesque like that. It's like watching or seeing a beautiful painting. So it's hard work. You can do it, and there are wonderful resources. Jerry Jenkins, who is also one of my closest friends, all he's done is sold 72 million books. That's all.
Yeah. Well,
and he's a painter. He's not a writer. He's a painter. So when you read a Jerry Jenkins novel, you can see it. You can experience it. In fact, I was having lunch with Jerry one time, and he was in the middle of writing a novel. And he said, I got to get back to my hotel room and keep writing. And I said, so what are you going to write about? He said, I have no idea. I have to start writing to figure out what's going to happen in the plot. And I thought, that is so cool. You're so involved in the story. You're painting a picture for your readers, and you can't wait. So you're unpacking the story like your readers are unpacking the story as they read it page after page. So this is, you asked me a simple question. I gave you a pageant, but I feel really passionate about this because I believe, like you, there are people with something really important to say, but they're not disciplined enough to hone their craft. They think if they get the words on a page and it's good material, people ought to read it. No, they're not. Unless you're a student in college and your professor told you you had to read it. People don't have to read your stuff.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of.
What you want to do is you want to compel them to read.
And I've had a lot of people that have said, I've thought about writing a book, and they could make it sound sort of flippant, like, I had just looking for a free weekend, and anyone who's ever written knows well, Churchill had a great quote about that. It's like,
Oh, yes, he did.
And ultimately becoming a monster that you barely slay with your last breath.
You fling out. Oh, yeah.
But I've said to people, sometimes you will have a message, but you, for whatever reason, you may not be the person. I mean, you just may not have the writing skills to put that on paper. And I've actually sent people, even to you, that at least in one case, a brilliant person, but English wasn't his first language. And so he was always struggling to try to put that into, really flowing, easy to read English. And so a lot was lost from his message. And so there are people that can truly grasp your message and help you put it into words that communicate. And of course, a phrase that I have had a lot of experience with is, the phrase that there's no such thing as good writing, just good editing. And I've had, my approach usually is fling stuff down. I mean, as it's in your head, get it on paper, type it up so it's there, and then go over and over and over and over, editing, cleaning up, take another run at it. Let other people read it and give you feedback, and then go back again. And I found now, Robert, I think even certainly in the last 40 years, in your experience, writing has changed. I find that, for instance, sentences are getting shorter, chapters are getting shorter. You might have had a 25 page chapter back in the day. And now you got 5-6 page chapters.
That's right.
And that's it. And the sentences, the words, they're moving, they're flowing. You don't ever get too bogged down in one chapter, before you sort of come up for air and you have a fresh sort of take in the next chapter. So there's a lot to it today. And certainly I think because of the way people are reading now, they're not reading 1,000-page biographies, and so
Right.
you even the way people read, you've got to adjust to that. With now they're reading blogs, and so you want them to read a 220-page book. You're going to have to write it in a way that someone that's used to reading blogs and computer screen length articles will sit there and not put down your 200-page book.
That's right. That's right. Well, from my own experience, I spend more time outlining the book than I spend writing it. So I'm working on my next book, and I outline on a spreadsheet. I have an Excel spreadsheet, and before I start writing, I know exactly where I'm going to go. I know the illustrations and the stories I'm going to tell in each chapter. So I outline it, then I write it, and then to your point, I spend more time editing than both of those combined.
Yeah.
And it's, every word. I mean, this is not an exaggeration. It may be a little bit, but almost every single word, especially verbs, you can tell a new writer because they use adjectives and not verbs. Use great verbs, and you can only use a great verb once in a whole book.
Yeah.
I keep a running list on my cell phone of great verbs. I could read it to you right now. And they're mostly ripped off from other people. But I'm saying that's great writing. And that's the discipline, really, of saying this is not glamorous at all. This is hard work.
Yeah, and I love Churchill, and I love some of his writing, but it's interesting because he had some words that he would say it once, and he loves the word sagacious, and he would say but
that's a great word.
But you can only use that. I mean, he would use it several times he'd write fairly long books, but it's like some words you can only get away with once or twice in a whole book, and then you start noticing. You're gonna have to work at that. But I love books though that they'll throw some words out there and they'll use them well, and I'll be challenged to get a dictionary or look it up. But on the other hand, and my wife has been a lifelong editor for me, Lisa, but if she's reading a book and there's 2 or 3 just blatant typos, things that got missed, she really struggles to keep reading. She loses all respect for, and the guy may be a genius, but just not edited well, and you start to just, I don't know, you can lose some of your esteem for the writer and it may not have been his fault at all. It might have been he just didn't have a good editor that was doing the work afterward. But little details can make all the difference, whether someone gets frustrated with your book or they hold on to it till they're finished.
Well, in the Lord's providence, he gave us dads who were godly, better than we deserved, and he gave us wives who are identical. And I think we need to make a pact with each other. We keep Lisa and Nancy away from each other. They will be totally dangerous. Yeah, Nancy will spot a typo on a billboard doing 80 miles an hour down the freeway. So she is just like Lisa. Yeah, she said to me yesterday, if I was a publisher and somebody sent me a proposal for a book and there was an apostrophe before the S rather than after the S, I wouldn't publish it. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I remember a book that was published, and it was a devotional book that my dad and I wrote that actually won some awards. Was still very, very popular book, but the editor would go through and edit about 25 to 50 of them at a time, and then he would send them to us and show us his suggested changes. And I mean, right. he was an excellent editor. And my wife would get those. She'd print them off, and she would get a cup of coffee and sit down in the living room in a comfortable chair. And she was like, I think she was like in love with this guy. Like she just loved to watch what a good editor could do, and how he could take a 7-word sentence and transform it into a 4-word sentence that was much more energetic and crisp. And I just keep hearing her saying, "Oh, he's good. Oh, that's amazing." And she just loved what a person could do with words. And when you read a book where you see that someone has really taken the time to just craft their words carefully, that's a huge. That's just a huge gift, I think, to the reader.
Yes, it is.
And
yes, it is.
And I'm big on stories. And you're right. I think people want stories, but there is a gift to that. You can also put unnecessary details into your story, and
Yes, you can.
and it begins to bog down and get slow, and it's dragged out, and you're ready for some resolution here, and you're still getting, all the hair color and what kind of bows and ribbons they had in their hair at the time, and you're at this point you just want to know who shot the person, but
Sure.
But the skill in saying what matters here, what doesn't. But so just Robert, if some person just has a manuscript, your advice first is get a platform, write blogs, get a growing number of people that appreciate your style, what you have to say. And then, of course, have a message, and that's experiencing God. My dad
It is so true.
My dad had no social media to this day. Doesn't know how to send an email, but he had a message that just burst through the seams and just took over.
Wow.
And so whenever I think about someone with a message, that's, you have to have that. I know some people have some really well marketed shallow books that don't really say anything, but they're marketed well. You want to have a good message, but then after that, but let me just ask you just for why would you have a literary agent? Because I think a lot of people look at that, they don't. They're not sure what the value or why you would do that. And of course, there's all levels. You work at pretty high end author stable, but there's agents at all kinds of levels that can work with brand new authors that are just writing their first book as well.
Right. But the answer to the question is the same reason why you'd have a realtor sell your home. You can put for sale by owner on your front yard and hope that the cars going back and forth include somebody who's looking for a house. Or you can go to a qualified realtor, and instead of having just the traffic in front of your house, you have tens of thousands of people looking at your home. Now, you're not going to have tens of thousands of publishers looking at your work, but what an agent does is they help you understand what people are looking for, and then how to market your story.
Mm-hmm.
So now, the truth is, I'm not looking for clients. So this is very easy for me to say because, literally, we aren't looking for clients. The Lord has blessed us with plenty of business. That sounds awful. I don't mean to be disrespectful. But there are agents who are looking for clients, and you can find them online. The other thing I would do, Richard, is, in fact, I sent you a link to a document, a PDF called Writing a Winning Nonfiction Book Proposal. And I don't know if your listeners, if you can, the technology exists, you can post that so they can access it. This has Michael Hyatt's name on it.
Yeah.
And Mike was my business partner for 16 years, one of my closest friends. I'm ticked off at him because he doesn't give me any credit whatsoever for this document. And that's totally fine. Who said? Zig Ziglar said, I think it was him, who said you can get anywhere you want if you don't care who gets the credit.
Yeah.
So, and that may have been Groucho Marx. I don't know. So, but that's what you need. Yeah, publishers throw away unsolicited manuscripts. Throw them away.
Well, and
recycled.
And Hyatt wrote the book Platform as well, which is a helpful book also.
He did. Yes, he did. Yeah. Right. So those two documents, his Platform book and this How to Write a Nonfiction Book Proposal, that you have access to now. I just sent you the link. If that would be helpful to you.
Sure, we'll post that.
You have to have that. Good. You have to have that.
And Rob, you've been there too. I've been in publishers' offices and seen literally stacks of unsolicited manuscripts just sent in, sitting on the floor, and that they're towering over their desk, and they've got full schedules all day long, and it's like in my spare time I'm trying to maybe glance at some of these manuscripts. And so, but when you have an agent who forwards that to a publisher, and that agent has a relationship, he's known for presenting quality material. He gets a listening ear. He gives you a hearing, and also some of those contracts can be pretty confusing. My dad in the early years, just before he had you, just said, show me where to sign. And he signed away all kinds of stuff he shouldn't have.
And it took us years to back that out and fix it.
But we're just so glad to have someone want to publish our stuff that you agreed to things that are kind of standard fare and some contracts that just you guys would just routinely just cross out and say you don't need to agree to that. You're giving away the farm for no reason. But And so, I think for those listening, you're right, we could talk for hours about the whole publishing, writing industry. But I think even with 1 million books a year coming out, you may have a book, and it's great if you can have a best-selling book out there that, millions of people are reading. But there's some. I've got a colleague who wrote a book basically for his family, and he just said, I want my grandkids and great-grandkids to have this book on their shelf that they can read at some point as adults and know where they came from and what our journey was like. And you can give it to colleagues, whatever. You don't have to go get that published by a publisher, but you still captured some of your story. And some people, when they start writing their story, they're going to realize, I think this would benefit a lot more than just my grandkids. And part of that, just let God show you. Maybe the last thing I'd say, Robert, is if you think you have a story worth writing about, field test it and go share it somewhere. And that's what Experiencing God was. My dad was just going around teaching Experiencing God, and publishers were chasing him down saying, please put this on paper. This is excellent. He was too busy teaching it to write it for the longest time. But when you I think that's why it was so powerful, because he'd field tested that. He knew every time he made certain statements, the whole room just kind of came apart, and people were just like desperate to have him say more. Yep. And so, we knew full well that if he ever put that stuff on paper, people would love it because we'd watched them loving it for years when he said it. So, if you're ever wondering, I've got these ideas, I don't know if they're very good. First thing I always say is, we'll go speak about it somewhere. And or put a blog about it and see what kind of feedback. And if there's just crickets out there, it's probably not as insightful of an idea as you thought it was. But but Robert, any last advice you might have? Just people thinking about that they've got this book idea. Any last sort of practical advice maybe to give them?
Well, I don't know the faith journey of the folks who are listening to our voices, but what I would say from my own experience is pray like crazy about this. You don't want to waste your time. You don't want to waste the valuable time of your friends and readers and so forth, unless it's a message that's important. Mm-hmm. And you told the story of Experiencing God. That's actually a classic story of what we're talking about here. Yeah. Don't just write on assignment. Write about what God is saying to you. Write about your own experience of failure and victory and success and trouble and brokenness and healing and redemption and all those things that people really care about, that have life-changing impact. So I don't want to discourage people. And I actually have helped people publish their own story, just like you've described. No commercial value, but their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren will be able to read their story. So that's not unusual at all. So that's a good idea to get that recorded just for posterity's sake, because, in fact, I just learned that I'm about to become a great-grandfather. Mm-hmm. The chance that this little boy will really know me are slim and none. Mm-hmm. And I know that sounds horrible, but it's true. So why wouldn't I jot some things down just by way of encouraging him, giving him a shot of the DNA that he's coming out of, and encourage him in the Lord? That's universal. That's timeless. The principles that are in Scripture, understanding God, realizing the power of the Holy Spirit, embracing the gospel, all those things don't change generation to generation. That's what I would encourage guys to do.
Well, thank you, Robert. Lots of words of wisdom. And for those listening, if God has given you a message, it may be a New York Times bestseller one day, or it might be something that blesses your grandkids and convinces them to keep following Jesus. But either way, if you follow through to the extent that the Lord leads you to, and not everybody's meant to be an author, but if you've got something that every time you share, it really encourages folks and blesses them, take a look at that, because quite frankly, the world needs more positive messages today. And so if you've got one, you add it to the mix and just add a bit more light to the darkness that pervades.
My favorite story about this is your daddy's story. He was faithfully preaching the word week after week, month after month, year after year. The last thing he ever thought was that he would sell millions of copies of what he was preaching. He was just faithful, and the Lord blessed that. And that's my favorite part.
Last thing to say on that, my dad was 55 years old when he wrote Experiencing God. The book that you wrote, The Gun Lap, his best work was written on his gun lap when he was already considered on the downward slope, if you will, of his career, and he produced his best work. So don't ever think, you've got a lifetime of experience, and that might be the best time to share the wisdom you've collected over a lifetime. So,
that's Robert, absolutely right.
Well, thank you for sharing with us. Always a delight. And we'll have links in the show notes to the different documents that Robert mentioned. Helpful stuff. And we encourage you, if God's put something in your heart, let him guide you and show you just how far you need to take that. But be a good steward of what God's put in your hands. It might bless generations to come if you handle it wisely.
Oh, that's great counsel. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.